joined this time by David Sirota, journalist and former speechwriter for Bernie Sanders. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Listen, I've been following your work for some time, and right now it seems the pressing issue that I see that you've been writing about and tweeting about and being very vocal about is the fight for 15, in particular as it pertains to Vice President Kamala Harris and the parliamentarian, all the procedures that are happening right now. Could you just kind of take us to where you are in terms of this specific fight?
Sure. The president of the United States and the vice president repeatedly and explicitly promised a $15 minimum wage if they win office. And we now have a situation in which that can happen right now. The COVID relief bill, the House passed bill, has the $15 minimum wage in it. There's a so-called reconciliation process, the so-called Byrd rule, which makes it harder to attach what they call non-germane things, non-related things into budget bills. But of course, the minimum wage is a budget matter. The Congressional Budget Office said it has about a $50 billion cost for some of the things that it would increase. So it should be ruled in order. Things that are smaller budget matters have been ruled in order by the Senate parliamentarian. And in this case, the Senate parliamentarian issued an advisory opinion saying that the minimum wage should essentially be taken out of the bill. Now, it's very important to understand that the parliamentarian is not a judge. It has no power. It is an advisor to the Senate Majority Leader about parliamentary procedure. The Senate Democrats and Vice President Kamala Harris, as the presiding officer of the Senate, can choose to ignore the parliamentarian's advice. That's happened in the past. So what could happen is that the vice president could say, I am not going to follow this advice. I disagree with this advice. I am the elected official. The reason I am the presiding officer, that the presiding officer is the vice president, is so that the elected official, not some unelected official, can make this determination. And I determine that this is wrong and the minimum wage can move forward. Unfortunately, the White House has said that so far to date that she will do the opposite of that she would rule with Mitch McConnell in support of the parliamentary advice to essentially rule the $15 minimum wage out of the bill, essentially killing it for at least for the time being. She doesn't have to do that. I believe she shouldn't do that. I don't think there's any reason to do that. We had an election. She made a promise. This is a perfect way to deliver on that promise.
And if we think about it just in terms of the politics, right, this is good politics for her to do this, right? So let's say she actually stepped out there and used her authority, constitutional authority, and ruled against the parliamentarian. They proceeded with the vote, notwithstanding Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, those threats, but just talk about how it would play out in terms of procedures as well as politically.
Well, would Manchin and Sinema vote against the minimum wage if Kamala Harris advanced it to essentially a floor vote? That's a good question. The President of the United States is the most powerful office in the world. The President of the United States has lots of tools at his disposal to try to influence those votes. The President of the United States could pressure those senators to get in line and vote for that minimum wage package. What could also happen in the House to add urgency to this is that you could have a number of House members, all you need is about 6 to 10 House members, to say we're not voting for a COVID relief bill that includes no minimum wage increase. And then basically say, if Joe Manchin is going to threaten to take down this bill for various reasons, we're going to threaten to take down this bill for various reasons. And the White House has to stop kowtowing to Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. The White House has to also listen to us. My view is if that played out, you could see some sort of compromise. You could see some sort of at least move towards a $15 minimum wage. But right now, those demands are not being made by the House Democrats. Joe Biden appears only to be negotiating with Joe Manchin. There was a report out there that Manchin has not been pressured to support a $15 minimum wage by the White House. So what you have is a situation in which Joe Biden is essentially not really lifting a finger to advance the cause of the $15 minimum wage that he promised.
And this is the troubling part about it, because in a lot of ways, it gives a lot of fuel to the fire for individuals or groups that argued against supporting Joe Biden from the left. And here we are, Joe Biden actually demonstrating at a minimum, the lack of willingness to fight on behalf of working people. Whereas we saw all of the campaigns, all of the campaign speeches, all of the tweets, we can have the record of them supporting $15 an hour. So why if there's a bigger political price to pay to not do this than there is to do this? What do you think is the calculus going on in the mind of Joe Biden and his supporters?
I think it's a good question, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, I can speculate that that there's this idea that you have to preserve so-called Senate norms, that ignoring a non-binding advisory opinion from a parliamentary advisor is somehow outrageous and hurts the institution. I mean, all these arguments exist in Washington in a bubble where really sociopathic arguments are considered normal. I mean, it is. I believe it's a relatively sociopathic argument to say that we have to respect the non-binding opinion of a parliamentary advisor, even if that means denying a raise of the minimum wage to millions and millions of workers who are struggling to get by. In the real world, in the normal world, that's sociopathic. Right. In Washington, that passes for a normal way to think. And that's part of the problem. And so it could be that. It could be that Joe Biden doesn't really want to do a $15 minimum wage, that he wanted to campaign on it, but wasn't really willing to do the work to actually make it get done, and didn't really want to make it get done. I mean, we have seen Joe Biden say things and then not deliver on them and lie about them over and over and over again. I mean, I don't enjoy flagging that. I don't enjoy spotlighting that, but that's the truth. Right. And so these questions are real, but we can speculate about what the reason is. But the bottom line is that we should be asking the question of power. What about the power dynamic is allowing for Joe Manchin to be controlling the discourse here? What power isn't being used by progressives to get the progressive agenda at the table? And again, I would go back to, in a narrow House, you can have 6 to 10 House Democrats threaten to take down this bill, which would force the progressive agenda to the negotiating table, which would force the White House to take those demands seriously. You could have 2 or 3 progressive senators in the Senate say that they're not going to vote for a COVID relief bill that doesn't include the minimum wage, but they're not willing to do it. Now, I will say one last thing. The obvious reason as to why they're, in some cases, not ready to do that is because of the argument that, well, the bill still has some good things in it, and we're not willing to take down a whole bill that has good things in it just for one thing. Manchin is willing to take down a whole bill. I guess the argument is because he doesn't care about the good things in the bill. And that may be true, but the bottom line is, the power equation here is, if you don't play hardball at the level that the other side is playing hardball, then you get rolled.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this is the frustrating part about it, is because we've seen the parliamentarian being ignored plenty of times before, right? And that's usually to the service of the wealthy, the top 1%. But in this case, it seems like it's an insurmountable hurdle. Would you compare just like previous iterations of when these rules were ignored versus now, where we can't ignore them for the sake of the people?
Sure. Look, it's not a regular occurrence that the parliamentarian is ignored. It has happened in the past. And again, I go back to, why would the rules of the Senate empower the vice president to make the decision and not an unelected parliamentarian, if not for the idea that an elected official, somebody who is a representative of the people, or is supposed to be representative of the people, that the reason that the Senate rules vest that person with the decision is because we still live in a republic. It is still supposed to be a democracy. The idea of blaming a parliamentarian who can be ignored or fired, blaming that person for the decisions that elected officials are making, is ridiculous. And I would remind you that when the Republicans faced this back in 2001, when they faced a parliamentarian whose advice they didn't like, they simply replaced that parliamentarian. That could be done right now. It's not being done. And so the people who are refusing to do that are making clear that they are not willing to fight for a $15 minimum wage.
And I think you kind of alluded to it, but I want to put a finer point on it before we run out of time here. It's almost as though they value the institutions and the norms of the Senate more so than the fight necessary for the people. Could you speak to that with a few seconds?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Sure, I think it's a good way to put it. That they want to fight for norms and an institution which has screwed over working people more than they want to actually fight for working people. And again, when we talk about norms, when we talk about rules, no one's talking about ripping up the rules. No one's talking about doing anything that violates the law. Literally in the Senate rules, it says that the vice president can do that. And so ask yourself, why would the rules say that the vice president can do that? Why would the rules allow for that? Why would they explicitly allow for that, if not to make sure that the vice president can represent the people? In other words, it's in the rules to make sure that the will of the people can be expressed through its representatives, and that something like the minimum wage, if a parliamentarian gives advice that is wrong or wrong-headed, that it gives the elected official the power to make sure that the right thing is done. If that power is not used, it is a statement that these people are not willing to actually fight to deliver on the promises that they made to millions of people.
Wow. David Sirota, journalist and former speechwriter for Bernie Sanders. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure's ours.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.